I started my very first company when I was still in school. I was in grad school and I found myself in a situation where my only form of transportation in school, this was in Boulder, Colorado, was a motorcycle. And that would not have been okay with my parents. So it was a secret and it was not anything that anybody knew. And then I went home for the holidays to the side of the family that is the Colombian side, which is my mother's side of the family. Went home to Colombia, spent time with family. Because I thought I was super cool and I knew how to ride a motorcycle now, I got overly confident and I rode my family's dirt bike around the rainforest. Well, this was cloud forest, so dense forest.
Yeah.
And anyway, I ended up wrecking. I screwed up my wrist and my knee, and here I am back in January, back in school with, again, the only form of transportation was a motorcycle, and now I have a bum knee and a bum wrist. So couldn't really ride my motorcycle, couldn't really ask my family for help with money. We weren't wealthy, so it would have been hard for them anyway. And so I ended up selling my motorcycle for what I could. And then with the cash that I had, I went to this dingy, just like dirty little used car dealership. And I noticed that all the big car dealerships, right? So like the Audi dealership, the Volkswagen dealership, right? The Toyota, they all had websites, even though back then the internet this was 1996. And so, but the internet was getting popular enough that like certainly the big companies had a basic website to give you basic information. But this little guy, right, this little used car dealership did not. So I went in and I basically said, I want to buy this car. And I only have half of what you're asking. I propose that for the other half that I don't have, I build you a website, because I was an engineering student. I had self-taught myself with my friends. We had all taught each other web development. And so basically I was like, I'll trade you a website for the other half. And he said yes, to my surprise. Next thing you know, I had other clients, and then I had a business partner that I brought in because I had more work that I could handle, and then another one. And that's kind of the story of how I started to be an entrepreneur. And then I liked it. I was good at it. I started 4 more ventures, some on my own, some in partnership with bigger companies. But that started what became ultimately a 15-year career as an entrepreneur, specializing certainly on the internet and tech. But down the line, I eventually became kind of an expert and a specialist in all things globalization. So figuring out, for example, how to make the Google algorithm work in Hebrew and Arabic and Japanese and Korean and French and Italian, and doing all of the work that sort of comes with globalizing technology, right? So yeah, that was my career in tech. And then in 2012, roughly, I left tech. I sort of retired from that career, and I decided to go back to school. And while I went back to school, I ended up co-founding at Columbia University at Barnard, which is where you and I met, the Center for Women Entrepreneurs, that really focuses on kind of passing it on, right? Or as my co-founder Kitty Colbert would say, paying it forward, right? Of, what was it like to be 15 years in the world of tech as a woman entrepreneur, right? And so how do I pass on some of what I learned? And so we created curriculum, and ultimately I wrote this book, right, called LEAPFROG. And I spent a lot of time really just focusing on doing that, paying it forward, encouraging other women to get into entrepreneurship, but also to get into tech. And also being really loud and vocal about all of the problems that I see in the investing world and in the tech world, all of the ways that the industry doesn't feel welcoming to women, and especially women of color. And in the process of doing that, it's one thing to complain and to speak out, and it's another thing to actually get your hands dirty and fix it. And so in 2016, I decided to start my last company, which was an investment company, because I realized that if you really want to change and improve the situation for women entrepreneurs. And if you really want to make an impact in your industry, which in my case was tech, then the way to do it is to go in a position of power, and fix it with influence and capital. And so I decided I would start investing. And then I've been doing that ever since. So ever since 2016, I've been a full-time investor, focusing on investing in companies that benefit women. So they don't have to necessarily be women-led, but they do have to prove to me that in some really meaningful, big way, they are going to benefit women economically. So if they can prove to me that because of their company, because of their technology, or because of their business, they are going to put more money into the wallets of many, many women worldwide, then I want to invest in them. So that kind of brings you, it's still entrepreneurial, right? But it's just a different aspect of it, where it's very much my own investing, and I'm still very much being an entrepreneur, but I get to help other entrepreneurs kind of make their dreams happen, right?
Wow. Well, your whole career sounds like a perfect fit for Sweet, and I'm excited to hear everything you have to say. That motorcycle story sure didn't seem funny at the time, but that's a pretty good starting story to tell now.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you learn I hope if people take anything from it, it's that not everybody wakes up saying, I'm going to be a doctor when they're 5, and then they go to med school and everything sort of is linear and planned and perfect. Like some of us end up where we end up by accident, right? And that's okay.
So your story is very inspiring. I mean, starting a career so young and in college. Who was your biggest inspiration throughout your career, and especially when you first started?
Um, I think at first it was my family, right? Because I don't know that I realized it when I was growing up, but my family worked initially in the sweatshops of Los Angeles in the fashion industry. And then my grandmother's a seamstress, and she came here as a grandmother. So she was older when she moved here. And then she brought each of her 5 adult kids to the United States from Ecuador over time. It took her like almost 15 years. I don't know how she did that on the wages of a seamstress, but she did. And part of how she did it, though, is because she always had a side hustle, right? So like she had her day job, but then on the weekends, she had a big industrial sewing machine that I think she must have bought from one of her employers. And she would make wedding dresses, and she would make quinceañera dresses. And so she had this sort of side job that she would work sort of nights and weekends. And it allowed her to make more money and to save money and save enough money to bring, her kids to the United States. And I think that as I found myself in like scrappy situations like that one in Boulder with the motorcycle, I was using the skills that my people like my grandma taught me, right? Like about, when you're in a pinch, you make do, you find a side hustle, you make money on the side, you figure out a way. And I think that sort of scrappy version of entrepreneurship, I largely learned from my family, right? And I've since obviously learned how to run big businesses where scrappy is maybe not the only thing you have to be. You now have to have real finance chops and all sorts of other operational skills. But at the core of it, I try not to lose sight of that scrappy small business muscle that maybe my family taught me, starting with my grandmother and then later my dad, and my mom as well. I think ultimately it's surprising to me how often, even when I'm managing big business with over 5,000 employees in 42 countries, like, yes, I learn new skills, but when push comes to shove and something unexpected sort of lands on my plate, I always kind of look back at those scrappy early days, and there's a lot of wisdom there. And I think that most people, without realizing it, have entrepreneurship in their family, even just in their history. Maybe not mom, dad, maybe grandparents, whatever. But if you look carefully at your family and at the people around you, you'll find, and you'll be surprised to see how much of those entrepreneurial lessons are actually like right under your nose, like probably in your own family. Because I definitely know I'm not the only one, but that's probably the biggest influence.
Definitely. You just have to look around and find entrepreneurship. And that story is incredible. Maybe probably more incredible than the motorcycle one. I can see why she's an inspiration. Wow. Clearly you haven't let age limit you starting your career at 20 while you're still in school. What would you tell a younger girl who wants to start a company, but she feels like she's too young or too inexperienced?
Oh my God, you're not too young and you're not too inexperienced. First of all, there was a woman, one of the first students that I met at Barnard when I arrived. Her name is Eva Sasan, who is still a friend and a mentee. I didn't think of her as a mentee, but she calls me her mentor, so I guess that makes me her that makes her my mentee. She was a junior when I met her at Barnard. So what does that make her, right? That's probably 19 or 20, similar. 2 years earlier, in her summer between her freshman and sophomore year at Barnard, she had, I think, wanted to get some internships, pretty classic, right? I don't think, get the ones that she explicitly wanted. And her dad said, well, if you're not happy with the internship landscape, then do your own thing. He is an entrepreneur. But she had never done anything like that. And she was nervous, I think, about sort of knowing where to begin, but ultimately leaned on friends. And a bunch of her friends, I think from high school, had stayed in touch. They were in different colleges all over the nation. And they had started to do mobile app development, some of them. And she was like, well, why don't we spend the summer doing that? And so they spent the summer building these really, really hyper simple mobile apps, where instead of having a bunch of bells and whistles, the mobile app does one thing. Like, it's got one button and it does one really useful thing. And it's just brutally, brutally simple. And they built that one, and then they built another. And next thing you know, they started to get downloads, and then they started to win like awards. And now they started to build more and more apps. And so this group of, former high school, classmates had a business, and they were building mobile apps. By the time I met her, it had been, right, the summer between her freshman and sophomore year, her entire sophomore year, and now here she was starting her junior year, and she was starting to wonder, like, what's next? Do I keep running this business? It's starting to kind of have a life of its own. It's been covered in the press now. Like I said, they had won awards, and she wasn't sure what to do with it, and she was contemplating just shutting it down. And that's when I met her. And of course, I brought her into what was a mastermind, which I cover in my book. It's a group of people who get together, in our case, for 9 months, so during the school year, once a month, and we talk about our businesses. And I made sure that the mastermind was half students, half adults in New York City. The thing that they all had in common, though, was that they were launching or had launched their businesses. And so we would have dinner once a month and talk. And I tell you the story because Eva ended up, with the help and encouragement of this group, selling her company in her junior year at Barnard. And then in her senior year, the company, it was an ed tech company that had purchased hers, they had not done anything with the assets, right? So they had acquired all these mobile apps and they had acquired all this code, but they had just kind of sat on it. They weren't growing it. They weren't doing anything with it. And the reason is because they had gotten acquired by someone else. So here are these things that Eva had built, and they had been purchased by somebody who wasn't doing anything with them. And before she walked on graduation day and got her diploma from Barnard, she had purchased her old company and the assets, right, back, which means that she is a student who, as far as I know, she's the first student at Barnard to ever start a company, sell a company, and buy that company back, all before graduation.
Oh my gosh.
And don't get me wrong, Eva is extraordinary, but she started even, earlier than I did. And she didn't know about selling a company, or much less buying one back, or any of that when she started, freshman year at school. But she figured it out. And I think that that's the thing, is it's not about experience. It's not about age, right? There are plenty of 60-year-olds who would be like, I wouldn't even know where to begin doing what Eva did. But Eva figured it out. And I think that that's what's important. I think that to build the muscle of knowing that you can figure anything out, whether it's obviously online, whether it's finding people, the way that you reached out to me and said, hey, can we do this interview, right? Sending that first email and just saying like, hey, I'm working on this. Can you help me? I need your wisdom. I need, I know that you're an expert at whatever. Those skills are probably the most important ones. And those skills you can have if you're 15 or 25 or 60. And I think that as long as you walk around this world knowing that, as one entrepreneur named Marie Forleo says, everything is figure outable. It doesn't matter how old you are or whether you have the experience. There's still so many things that I have zero experience on. Mm-hmm. But if you ask me to try to figure it out, I feel confident that I can, not because I think that I'm going to be an expert at something that I know nothing about, but because I believe that I can find that expert and I can probably get them to partner with me or teach me or even, let me hire them to figure it out. And I think that that's it. That's something that transcends age and experience.
Wow. That was a really great story. You sound so cool.
It was amazing.
It sounds like reaching out is definitely a very important step in getting mentors and learning a lot. So for a girl who is ready or feels ready to start her own company, what would you say is the most important first step?
Identifying whether there is truly a need, right? And you went through this with me in the summer camp, right, at Barnard, where a lot of times people talk about how you should follow your passion. And I just think, especially, look, you and I, excuse me, you and I are talking right now. I don't know when you're going to publish this article, this podcast, but we're talking currently in August of 2020, right? There's a pandemic. There's an economic crisis. Unemployment has hit some of the highest rates since the Great Depression in the United States. On top of that, you have people's civil rights being violated on the streets and people out protesting in protection of those civil rights, right? There's so much going on that what you learned in my summer camp last summer is more important than ever. And that is that you might be passionate about many things, right? And I think most people are multi-passionate, right? But just because you're passionate about it doesn't necessarily mean that the world wants that solution, right, to that problem. And I think that what you guys did is you did this exercise, which I talk about in my book. And it actually started in the summer camp, and then eventually I adapted it and put it in my book. And that's this exercise that I call finding things that you want to punch in the face, right? Mm-hmm. And you just make lists and lists of things, big or small, right? Big meaning like racism, maybe, right? Or small, like this app that I have on my phone freezes every time I try to do XYZ, right? That's really small, right? It doesn't matter. Just make that list of things that you just want to punch in the face that drive you nuts, right? Mm-hmm. And then what you'll find is if you exercise that muscle, eventually you start thinking through, okay, of this list of 50 things that I've been compiling, of all the things I want to punch in the face, how would I solve it, right? And how would I solve it in a way that I could actually use in a way that makes it commercial, meaning that how do I solve it in a way that ultimately makes it so that I can sell something, be it a service or a product, right, that gives people the solution to this problem. And the reason that I go about it this way, and I think this is a good first step, is because if it's something you want to punch in the face, it's probably something that you are in fact passionate about. But if it bugs you, there's a pretty good chance that it bugs someone else, right? And I use this expression often that people don't buy vitamins, they buy cures, right? And so if you found a solution to something that irks you, there's a chance that there's a lot of other people who share that same problem, then you may in fact have yourself a really viable product or a really viable solution that other people desperately want and need. And if you stumble upon something like that, or the idea that you have sort of passes that test, then there's probably something there. It doesn't mean that the first idea that you came up with is going to be the final idea, because as you saw, even during the course of a 2-week camp, the idea you had on the first day it morphed, it changed, it evolved. By the time you got to the final day and you guys were pitching your businesses, it had changed a lot, right? And that happens. It happens at whatever your first business idea, it evolves, right? Because you learn, because your customers tell you things. But if you start with that one nugget, find that thing that you want to punch in the face, you will probably find that there is at least the nugget of a really good potential business idea there. And that's where it all begins.
That was a great and such a memorable activity. I don't think I'll ever forget that. I still remember other people's answers. I was just replaying them in my head. So thank you for sharing.
Yeah, it was great, wasn't it? I mean, that's one of my favorite parts, is hearing other people's things they want to punch in the face,
Yeah.
right? It's just such an amazing way to be creative and to create creativity. I think a lot of people think they're not creative, right? Or you think that, like, if I'm a math and science person, that I'm not an arts person, and that's ridiculous. You can be all of those things at once, or you can truly be like all in with math and science, but that doesn't mean that you're not capable of being creative. Creativity is a muscle. You just have to exercise it. And exercises like this, like, hey, just make a bunch of lists of things you want to punch in the face. That is the sort of exercise that gets your creative juices flowing. And as you saw in a group of, over 30 women in a room, I guarantee you that not all 30 plus women thought that they were really creative. And yet each and every one of them came up with awesome ideas.
Definitely. So switching gears a little, as you know, as an entrepreneur, there are many, many ups and downs. It's a roller coaster ride. Mm-hmm. So especially as a woman entrepreneur, what would you say is the most challenging part and also the most rewarding part?
So the challenging part is that people believe that being an entrepreneur means ultimate freedom. You don't have a boss, right? But as you experienced in building your business over the course of the summer camp, right? You still have to answer to someone. And the person that you have to answer to first and foremost is your customer, right? If you're going to have a thriving business, and if you're going to succeed at being an entrepreneur, your boss in many ways has to be your customer, right? If they're not happy, you've got to make changes. If you find that they're needing something different than what you're offering, again, you got to make adjustments, right? And so in many ways, this idea that, being an entrepreneur it's freedom, you don't have a boss, you kind of do, right? And then if you're the sort of entrepreneur, which most entrepreneurs don't do this, but if you do decide to go down the path of being the kind of entrepreneur that goes out and gets investments, well, your investors are people that you have to answer to, right? And so I think that's one of the hard things about entrepreneurship, is that no matter how you look at it, you have people that you have to answer to, right? And I think sometimes what we get sold is this idea that entrepreneurship is total freedom and you don't have a boss and you can do whatever you want. In fact, entrepreneurs, I think, work harder, longer hours, and probably lose a lot more sleep than people who have a more traditional 9-to-5 job, right? So that's the downside. The upside is that if what you're doing is truly solving a problem, and if what you're doing is truly something that you believe in, then it doesn't feel like work. And so, yeah, if you're going to log my hours, I work incessantly. And even when I'm on vacation, I'm working. And, people would say maybe I'm a workaholic, but the lines for me are super fuzzy. I can't tell you when I'm working or not working. This is a perfect example, right? I'm passionate and I love making sure that the next generation of women have it, or not necessarily have it easier, because I don't think you're going to have it easier, but at least learn from my mistakes and my experience, and you have the freedom to go and make your own mistakes and your new solving new kinds of problems, right? Because that's how we progress forward. And so is this hour, half hour, whatever that I'm spending is it work? No, like, I'm not getting paid for this. This isn't core to my business. So I would say, some would argue that this is work, and some would argue that it's not. I don't care. All I know is that I'm doing stuff that I care about. And it's hard to draw the line between sort of what is work and what is personal when everything that I do is something that I'm passionate about. And I think that a lot of entrepreneurs have that, where like they've got this fire in their belly and they're ultimately trying to solve a problem. And for me, the problem is we don't have enough women entrepreneurs who are thriving. We have plenty of women entrepreneurs. Don't let anybody tell you that there aren't enough. Women are starting businesses at twice the rate of men in the United States. So we're the majority in terms of new businesses. And of those businesses, 8.9 out of 10 of them are started by a woman of color. So not only are women starting more businesses, but women of color are really dominating in the space. And people would have you believe that that's not true, but it is. So what the problem is most women-owned businesses don't transcend the $1 million a year revenue mark, which means that we're starting businesses like crazy. We are the most entrepreneurial in the country, but we're getting stuck and we're not growing our businesses. And that's because we don't get loans, that's because we don't get investments, that's because of a lot of structural things. It's not because of us, it's largely because the system isn't really supporting us the way that it supports male-owned businesses. And so I want us to think about that as an upside, right? And that's kind of why I think, I don't know, the upside of being an entrepreneur is that you can focus on these really big problems. And nothing is better for getting up in the morning and being excited about life than knowing that even if it's hard, today I'm going to get like this much closer to solving this problem that I really care about, right? And that's ultimately, I think, what being an entrepreneur is. And it's even if it's hard, it feels good.
Your work is very important, and you've made incredible leaps and bounds. LEAPFROG, leaps and bounds.
Good, I have you using it.
With, the gender gap and addressing diversity. So can you talk about the ways that you handle those as an entrepreneur?
Me personally, or just generally in the space?
Both. You and with the companies in your book.
Yeah. My book was written for women, so that's one thing, right? The summer camp that I built that you participated in is for young women, right? I am pretty unapologetic about who I'm serving. And I think that that's important, right? I have definitely gotten pushback, even at, in university settings, like, why are your classes for women only? And my answer is, look, women get less than 5% of venture capital. We're getting very few of the loans, business loans. Over 90% of women-owned businesses do not transcend that $1 million a year in revenue mark. Like, I'm going where I am most needed, and I'm going in the place where there is most growth that's possible, right? And where change is going to be more important. So that's one way that I do it, is I unapologetically focus on where I think the need is greatest. The businesses that I invest in are businesses that disproportionately benefit women. I think we talked briefly about some of the areas that I'm passionate about. When we first met, but I'm passionate about climate. I'm passionate about gender fairness. And I also am really, really passionate about things where there's an intersection of the two, right? So there are many cases where you can tackle climate and you can also address, the gender gap. And I think that, in fact, given that women hold some of the most effective solutions to climate change, everything from educating women on reproductive health, when women are given nothing more than an education and the ability to choose when and how to have babies, it is just a natural outcropping that statistically, globally, when you see that happen, women tend to have smaller families, right? And there are so many things like that where it's like gender and being fair and having women, have all of the resources that they need to have an education. And then later, if they choose to have kids, to choose when and how. Those things have a massive impact on things like climate. And so those are the areas where I really focus on most. If they intersect, amazing. If it's a solution that's really about climate or a solution that's really about gender, I love it. And a lot of the work that I do out in the world where it's advocacy work, right? When you see me on TV talking on MSNBC about the fact that Black and brown owned businesses were rejected for over 90% of the federal stimulus loans for small businesses. That's a problem, right? We've got millions of Black and brown owned businesses now that are going to go bankrupt and or just go away and not come back. So whether I'm speaking or I'm investing or I'm teaching, right, I just focus on where I see that the problem is greatest. And I think that no matter what that is, you'll find me gravitating towards, where not only is the need greatest, but where I think the upside is greatest. One of the most famous investors in the world, Warren Buffett, he tends to invest always in undervalued assets. And it's not just him, that's just a standard great way to invest. You invest in things that are undervalued because the upside is highest, right? And when I look at how undervalued women are, especially women entrepreneurs, I cannot think of a better place to invest and put my energy into than into that, incredibly undervalued group of people, right?
Thank you for all of your work. And I'm excited, much more excited to be a young entrepreneur with women ahead of me like you. Thank you.
I'm so glad that you're doing what you're doing.
Can you talk a little bit about your book and what made you want to write it and some of the things that are in it?
Yeah. Eva and her classmate, a few of them actually, were all that was the first sort of class of students that I started to really get to know at Barnard. We created these masterminds, right, where we would get 8 women together and we would have dinner once a month, and amazing things happened, like Eva selling her company, right? That's just one story though. There were 7 other women and everybody accomplished so much, and largely with the help of each other, we created this amazing pack of women that were really, really supportive of one another. We decided that magic that had happened during the mastermind is something that we wished we could scale, and we wish that more women all around the country and around the world could have access to this. And so it first started off as, great, so let's write a book that tells people how to build a mastermind and how to run it and how to organize it. And then what happened was I started to bring in more stories of people that were not just about Barnard and that were not just about our program and the Athena Center, but now I've started to get stories from, my friend Kat Cole, who runs Focus Brands, who own Jamba Juice and Auntie Anne's and Carvel's, and she was teaching us about franchise businesses, which you learned about, which I'm obsessed with, because I think the model of franchises is a really awesome way to potentially take a small business idea and scale it really, really fast. And for new entrepreneurs, it's a way to be in business for yourself, but not by yourself, which I also love. And so I started to get wisdom from women mostly, but also amazingly talented men who had nothing to do with the college and nothing to do with the Athena Center. And so then it started to become really clear that the book was getting to be bigger than just about masterminds. It was getting to be bigger than just the college. And it was my agent and also Kitty, my co-founder at Barnard, who was like, Nathalie, this book is getting bigger. It's transcending just the scope of what we're doing here at the college. And it's really feeling like it's your book. And so at that point, we shift gears and we start talking with my co-writer about, okay, if you could just put all the wisdom that you wanted to in this book and not constrain yourself with any one concept, the mastermind is still a chapter in the book. So it's still there, right? And the stories from Athena are still there. It became so much bigger. And so now we have over 63 of the most wise and experienced and also scrappy and fabulous entrepreneurs like Eva. Their stories are in the book now. And it's taken the shape of 50 hacks, where it's 50 basically kind of shortcuts is what it ultimately is for being successful at business on your own terms, right? Many times going against common wisdom or the typical business media that tells you you have to do things in this one very specific way. I know for a fact that there is way more than that one way to be successful. It's just that in the business media, we get fed one way, right? You're a wealthy kid like Mark Zuckerberg who, or Bill Gates, right, who goes to an Ivy League school, and then you raise money from your friends and your family who also have money, and you start a tech company, and the rest is history. Well, there are a lot of other ways to be successful. That is one of thousands. And what I tried to do in the book is to show stories of lots and lots of other people who have been successful, but done it in a way that is different from what the media feeds us, so that people, especially women, can start to see themselves in these stories and say, okay, can't really relate to Bill Gates's origin story, but this woman, Nina Vaca, who has $1 billion company and never took a penny of venture capital and started this business in her living room, I can totally relate to that, right? Or my story of the motorcycle, right? And so many other stories like that. My friend Kat Cole, she actually dropped out of undergrad and then eventually went and got an MBA before she had even finished her undergrad, because she had had so much life experience working at Hooters, where she started as a hostess and then eventually became vice president and helped Hooters expand into all these countries around the world. So I just try to fill the book with as many stories as I can that are a little bit off the beaten path, so that women especially can see that there are so many unique ways to be successful as an entrepreneur. And if they see themselves in some of these stories in the book, my hope is that they can realize that they are totally capable and they have everything that they need to not just follow in the footsteps of all these 63 people profiled in my book, but to hopefully just invent a whole new path, right?
Those stories all sound so important to share. I didn't even know that was possible to go to grad school before undergrad.
I didn't
That is
either.
so
She
cool.
didn't. I mean, it wasn't before, but she dropped
Yeah.
out of undergrad, and then because she had to work, because she was supporting her family and everything else, and then by the time she had worked so many years and been so successful early on, right, at this first job that she had, the MBA school just said, you know what, you have equivalent life experience that you may as well have a bachelor's. And so, yeah, they let her into Georgia Tech, which is a great school to get an MBA from. Yeah.
Well, I hope as many girls as possible who watch this video also read LEAPFROG. And I know it might be hard to choose, but if you could pick the top 3 hacks in the book or just skills in general that you think to be a successful entrepreneur, what would they be?
3 skills. I would say, I know I talked about this in the beginning, but it's definitely one of my favorites, is start scrappy. And when you're young and you maybe don't have a lot of cash, you kind of have to stay scrappy, right? Because you have no choice, right? Like me and the motorcycle story. But the thing about staying scrappy is remembering your roots, so that even when you do have more money, even when you do have an investor who writes you a big check, you could now spend a lot of money on that big fancy office, or get your super fancy car or whatever else. But it's about starting scrappy and staying scrappy, because that muscle of making do and of finding creative solutions is a muscle that should never go away. And if you do stop using that muscle, it does go away. And so I think that that's the lesson, right? I talk about it in the book about how, even though when I started my investment company and now I'm like, this is my 6th company, I could have afforded, prime real estate in New York City for an office. But why? I went and I found places, accelerators and incubators, where a lot of entrepreneurs are. And I said, do you guys want an investor in residence? I'll commit to spending, I don't know, 2 hours a week and do like office hours for your community. In exchange, I'd like some office space. And they gave me office space, right? And so I didn't have to do that. But I think that using that muscle is part of how you stay on top of your game as an entrepreneur, right? So start scrappy, stay scrappy. The other thing that I would say is that people don't realize that debt is almost more important than investment. There are a lot of companies that will never get an investor, but they definitely got a loan at some point, right? And maybe it wasn't a normal sort of business loan, maybe it was a line of credit, Maybe it was a small business administration loan. The Small Business Administration, which is a, part of the federal government, give really great loans to small business owners. These are really important things that will oftentimes help you grow your company. That's how you can double, triple your company, right? Because even if you're making money and the company's doing fine, like if you need to invest in something big, just taking it from your revenues isn't going to be possible. You might need one big injection of cash, right? And that can come in the form of a loan. And so what I tell people, entrepreneurs, no matter how old you are, make friends with your local bank. Make sure that you know like who's the loan officer there and that they know about your business, right? Like, hi, loan officer, it doesn't matter how old I am, but I want you to know that I'm starting this business and I'm making whatever, right? And someday I'm probably going to need a loan. So I want you to know that I'm here, that I have a business. Maybe I've started a checking account in this bank, right? Wherever that checking account is, you make sure that you have a relationship with that loan officer, that they know your name, that they know who you are, and that they're tracking you, so that someday when the day comes that you do want to get that, business loan, you're not just coming in cold. You already have a relationship and they've kind of been tracking you, and hopefully they like what you're doing. Hopefully they find what you're doing is inspiring and they're kind of rooting for you, so that when it does come time to apply, they're going to go the extra mile. They're going to really try to get you that loan. There's a chapter in my book that's called Debt is Not a Four-Letter Word. And it basically talks about this, about how we don't talk to entrepreneurs enough about debt and loans and how important it is. And then let's see, what's my third favorite? My third favorite is probably a story that you'll recognize, because one of the field trips at summer camp was to Hanky Panky, right?
Yeah.
If people aren't familiar with Hanky Panky, it's a high-end lingerie brand. It's been around for over 40 years now. You can only get it at fancy retailers like Barney's and Saks Fifth Avenue and so on. You can't get it, I don't believe, like on Amazon and whatnot. They're an amazing brand. They have what they claim, and what I believe they've trademarked even, is the most comfortable thong in the world. They use amazing material. You had an opportunity to go to their factory in Jamaica, Queens, right? They're made in the USA. And what I love about this hack, which is the last hack in the book, is that we get fed this idea that in order to be successful as an entrepreneur, you have to prove it by having an exit, which means that at the end of the day, you sell your company for a ton of money, or maybe you IPO and it goes public, right? And it's on NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange. And what Hanky Panky proved to me, and I hope proves to everyone, is that there are so many other ways to be successful, right? And there's so many other ways to define a happy ending when it comes to business, right? And in their case, it's that they piled all 140 of their employees into the factory in Jamaica, Queens that you visited on their 40th anniversary for what everybody thought was just going to be a celebration. And they announced, the two founders, Lita Orzek, who I believe you definitely met, right?
Yeah.
And her partner, Gail, they walked into this celebration of their 40th anniversary and they proceeded to announce to all of their employees that they were giving the company to them. And, it's not a novel idea. It's called an ESOP. And what it is it takes shares of the company and it hands it all to the employees. In their case, they're not retired yet. So they still have authorization to continue to run the company, but they have an employee representative on the board. But over time, what will happen is that as Lita and Gail retire and step away from the day-to-day operations of Hanky Panky, the owners of the company, the ownership transitions to the employees, and they have to organize themselves and decide, who's going to take which roles. But the bottom line is that these people, in some cases, have been working for tens of years, in some cases, probably over 30. I know that there are some employees that have been with them from the early days, and they worked, their butts off to make this company successful. And now they get to be part owners of the company. And I tell that story and I end the book that way, not because that's the end all be all, but because it's just an example of two women who said, no, We're not going to sell our company to some private equity firm that's going to turn it into God knows what. And we have no interest in going public with our company. We're going to think of another way, something that doesn't quite fit the standard template. We're going to come up with our own definition for what success is and what a happy ending looks like. And they did that. And I love the way they did it. And that's why I love their story. But I hope what it does is it gives people this idea that there's a third way. And guess what? There's a fourth and a fifth and a sixth, and there's probably 150th way that we just have not thought of to define success. And I want women entrepreneurs to sort of define that on their own terms, the same way that Lita did.
Thank you so much for sharing that, because I certainly didn't know that before Barnard, and I'm sure a lot of other girls had no idea that was even a possibility until just now. So thank you. So when you do face the tough times, how do you get past setbacks? And also on the flip side, how do you celebrate when you accomplish a goal?
I am better at that now. I think that it was probably harder when I was younger because I didn't know if I could bounce back from a failure, right? I have now bounced back enough that I know that I can, right? And I think that part of how I do it is I lean on my friends and my family, and I have my sort of inner circle. I think that's really important. I think especially in these days when it feels like you know lots of people, because you might have, in my case, I don't know, whatever, thousands of people following me on social media. Like, it's very easy to feel like there's this wide group of people who know who you are, but who knows you actually deeply. And so that inner circle of good friends becomes more important, I think, than ever. And that inner circle of friends are the ones that I call when something is really difficult, when I can't figure out a problem, or when I crashed and burned and something that I tried failed and I have to start again. I lean very, very much on my network. And it's funny because sometimes it's not even because they don't necessarily have answers or solutions. It's just, that thing that happens when you feel down on yourself and you just need to get together with people who care about you and remember that there are more important things always, right? So that's how I think I get through it. I lean very much on my community and my people. The good times, I'll be honest, I don't think I'm good at that. I don't think I'm good at celebrating. I think there's a book called Love Languages, which is about relationships, but I actually think it's relevant to anyone, even employees and in a work environment. Like, some people really want to be cared for with what the book calls words of affirmation, right? Complimenting people and telling them you did a great job, whatever. Other people are much more about like touch and like giving someone a pat on the back, or like giving someone a hug when they're not feeling great, right? Whatever. That's the tactile people, right? And other people are about gifts. If you give them a gift, they feel really special, right? And what's funny is there's another one, and that one is acts of service. Acts of service is what I am 100%. Like, do not compliment me. I do not want anybody complimenting me. It means nothing to me. Whatever, it's just words, and gifts, I have a no gifts policy, and it bugs the hell out of my friends who love to give gifts, because even right now I'm staying in a temporary place that I've been staying in since March because of the pandemic, and my own good friends, they're like, can you give me your freaking address so I can send you some flowers or a thank you or whatever? And it's like, no. And my assistant knows. Natalie has a very strict no gifts policy. She will not give my address away even to friends because I don't want, that's not my thing, right? And I'm sort of a minimalist and I don't need to be accumulating stuff. So for me, it's very much acts of service. If you take the time to research something that I like and give me an article that is about something that I'm really interested in, that's an act of service. That takes time, thoughtfulness, like whatever. And I think that as a result, maybe because I'm not big on compliments and stuff, I don't try to push myself into situations where I'm going to be flooded with a bunch of people saying, congratulations, good job. Like, what, I just cringe. And it's funny because that's, not everyone's like that. That's who I am. And as a result, I think that when I celebrate, I probably celebrate small, right? I probably just, there's a handful of people in my life who know. When we're not in the middle of a pandemic, maybe we'll go to dinner and maybe I'll talk about how I'm excited about this thing that happened. But it tends to be pretty small, and I move on really quickly, and it's probably something I should work on because I know that it's good to celebrate things. But there's so many problems to solve that I tend to be like, all right, that was good, next. And I just kind of move on to the next thing, which I don't know, may or may not be a good thing, but there it is.
That book sounds really cool. I definitely want to check it out. I want to see which one I am too.
Yeah, it's a good one. I think it helps you with relationships, again, friendships or lovers or anything, because what people do is they tend to give you what they need, right? So those friends that want to give me gifts, it's because they like getting gifts. It's like,
Yeah.
no matter how many times I'm like, I don't care about gifts, but it tells you something about how they want to be appreciated. And so I do make a note of those things. It's like, all right, well, I know that clearly you love gifts, so I'm going to make sure to remember your birthday and to, be sure to send you a gift when that happens, or whatever, to celebrate. It's a good way of getting to know yourself, but also getting to know how other people want to be cared for, right?
Definitely. Our last question today is, could you share a funny story from your career?
Oh my gosh, a funny story from my career. Yes. God, there's so many. Okay.
There's a few.
There's a recent one which just goes to show, I don't know what it goes to show. It just goes to show that you can't take yourself too seriously. I was invited to this summit called the Academy of Achievement. It takes place, I think, every 2 years. It's a weird way of inviting you. It's very cryptic, and I don't know who nominates you. I finally discovered who nominated me. Weirdly, it was the president of the Inter-American Development Bank, who I didn't even know very well. He just saw me speak somewhere and then said, I nominate her. And so I got this weird nomination letter, and it was like this list of very famous people are inviting you to come to this thing. And I was like, this is going to be some Nigerian prince asking me to wire him money. Like, this is clearly a fake. And so I deleted it and I ignored it. And then they kept sending, they're like, are you going to accept or not? Because we're going to, if you do, we have to buy your ticket and we have to reserve your hotel. And I'm like, yeah, right. And I sent it to a few friends and I'm like, this is bogus, right? And my friends are like, yeah, this is bogus. And then finally I had one friend who was like, this sounds vaguely familiar. I think I remember hearing about something called the Academy of Achievement, whatever. So I was like, fine, you know what? It's probably bogus. I'll just say yes. And I'll know that they're bogus or not when I find out whether the, flight to London is a real ticket. And we can, I can have my assistant call the hotel in London and see if it's a real reservation. Like, fine. So yeah. I said yes, mostly just to see. And then it turns out it was real. And they flew me to London, and they said it was black tie, so I had to go with all these fancy dresses. And anyway, just sit down at this table, and Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin is sitting at the table. Valentino, the fashion designer, is sitting at my table. 2 tables down is Bill Clinton, and Sting is performing at dinner. It was the weirdest, craziest thing I've ever experienced. And then there's this guy who, I'm gonna get in trouble for saying this, but there is this guy who looks like he doesn't belong there at all. His hair is a mess and he just looks really unkempt, and yes, he's wearing a tuxedo, but it doesn't look comfortable. And I'm just like, hey buddy, who are you? Like, it's nice to meet you. And he's like, my name is so and so. I would not even have remembered. And I was like, and what do you do? And he's like, I'm in film. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. And, what have you worked on that I might have seen? And he's like, Lord of the Rings. So I was sitting next to Peter Jackson, and I had no idea. And I would never have known. He looked a mess and highly uncomfortable, and like he should not be wearing a tuxedo, but there he was. And I wasn't rude. I would never have been rude at all, but it was one of these moments where you're just like, not everything looks not everything is as you might think it is. You never know who's sitting next to you. Uh, and I felt like an ass, and I should feel like an ass because that was a silly thing to happen. But every once in a while you get a slice of humble pie and you sit next to Peter Jackson, who tells you he's in film. And he could have picked like some obscure movie to tell me about because he's made a lot of things that I wouldn't have recognized. But of course, he was trying to make a point, and he did, and he made it. And I'll never make any assumptions again.
You have shared some really great stories, and they just kept getting better, and I think that was the best one. Thank you
That was
so
a
much
strange trip.
for all of
Oh,
your
thank you
time
for
today.
inviting me. And thank you for doing everything that you're doing. I'm excited to see who else you interview.